Ellis Island. What was once the gateway to the New World has now been turned into a museum as the United States argues over the immigration policy. When Ellis Island opened in 1892, it brought stability to our country's immigration process and kept that stability for over 60 years. But when the island closed in 1954, the number of immigrants entering the United States dropped drastically. Until the United States government published the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, immigration was in ruin and protests broke out, demanding reform on the immigration policy. It wasn't until the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 that our immigration policy finally wasn't the number one thing at the top of everybody's agenda at every government meeting. I mean, they discussed this for 11 years until they published this new act. So the effect of Ellis Island's opening and closing is very obvious in our history based off of that. I mean, just look at the immigration numbers from around the world in general. I mean, around that time, immigration was down because of Ellis Island's closings. So just look at the numbers and you see that the effect is very obvious. When the United States opened Ellis Island in 1892, nearly all immigrants entered the U.S. through the island. It was considered by many the gateway to the New World. In the first year alone, over 450,000 people entered through Ellis Island. We look at that number, 450,000, and in today's numbers, we think, oh, that's nothing. That's not a lot of people. Back then, in 1892, not a lot of people were willing to immigrate, if you think about it. I mean, there were families still to be left behind. There were old lives. So, I mean, that number is massive if considering their time. Over the next 5 years, over 1.5 million people would enter the United States through Ellis Island, and that's about when the mini empire of Ellis Island was born. In 1907, Ellis Island reached its peak, receiving 1,004,756 people in 1 year. When World War I came several years later, immigration took a hit, but after the war, things went back to normal and Ellis Island admitted over 575,000 people in 1921. Then after the Immigration Act of 1924 restricted immigration, fewer and fewer people were entering through Ellis Island and the island began to fall apart. That was the first domino to fall in the destruction of Ellis Island. I mean, that Immigration Act, that killed immigration around the world, to be honest, because people didn't want to come to the United States anymore. Then World War II came, and Ellis Island became the exact opposite of what it was supposed to be. Instead of allowing foreigners to enter into the United States, it became a prison for many foreigners. Ellis Island became a prison for Axis soldiers in World War II, and it doubled as a hospital for Allied soldiers and as a training ground for the United States Coastal Guard. Then the Internal Security Act of 1950 was put into effect, and that really marked the beginning of the end for Ellis Island. Ellis Island was closed in 1954, but the island was added to the Statue of Liberty National Monument in 1965, and the island became a museum in 1990. Since its opening, it has received over 40 million visitors who come from far and wide to see the birthplace of U.S. immigration. Even with the island being closed for almost 70 years, the effect of Ellis Island has still been felt throughout history and is still felt today. Ellis Island set the standard for immigration stations into the U.S. When it opened, our country gained a sense of stability that we hadn't felt before. And then when it closed, it showed us what we had to do to get back to that stability. And it also showed what we have to do to have a stable immigration policy. Even today, with everything, with our current president and the debate about the immigration policy, Ellis Island set a standard that won't be forgotten anytime soon. That's just my opinion. Today, even though we don't have a singular point of entry, immigrants just kind of enter anywhere they want. Our policy is just stable enough to keep those immigrants coming, and I think we have to thank Ellis Island for that.